Hi, my name is Sophia Mecklai, and today I will be presenting about comparing licensing for fission and fusion power reactors and the implications for future fusion regulations. Before I get into it, though, here's just a little bit about me. I am currently zooming in from Mercer Island, Washington, and I am a sophomore at Mercer Island High School. My goals for today are to talk about why this is such a relevant project, some key words, and then I'll discuss how nuclear fission and fusion actually work, as well as some similarities and differences. Then I'll go into what the current fission regulatory landscape looks like, as well as what the current fusion regulatory landscape currently looks like and the limitations of that fusion landscape. And then it'll be a conclusion. So, nuclear fusion, why is it so important? It is a clean energy source, and part of the fusion fuel is extremely abundant in our atmosphere. So, compared to things like nuclear fission, it has an abundant fuel source, and unlike wind power or solar power, you're not relying on the weather to give you energy. Nuclear fusion also doesn't run the same risks as nuclear fission does, which makes it extremely beneficial. So some key terms for today are the NRC, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They are a branch of the government who determines what all of the regulations will be for nuclear uses. Then we have CFR, which is the Code of Federal Regulations, which is split up into over 50 parts, and those basically detail everything that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has decided upon and what exactly those regulations look like. Then we have fusion power plants, and the important thing to note is that we have never actually built a fusion power plant, which is the other reason why this presentation is so relevant, is that it is determining what those regulations will or should look like for fusion power plants. So that way we actually can go towards building one. Then we have fission power plants, and the last two, particle accelerator and nuclear proliferation, just keep in the back of your mind, and I will talk about them later. So how exactly does nuclear fusion work? Deuterium and tritium, which are two isotopes of hydrogen, are compressed under extremely high pressure and extremely high heat. And that goes to produce a singular heavier atomic nuclei, which causes a massive release of energy. And that release of energy is what'll go to actually producing our electricity. And as I mentioned, our fuel source, or part of our fuel source, would be extremely abundant in our atmosphere, as they are isotopes of hydrogen, and hydrogen does make up so much of our atmosphere. But more specifically, deuterium is extracted from seawater, and tritium is actually very minimal in our atmosphere, but it can be artificially created from lithium. And if we were to have a fusion machine, that's what we would do. In comparison, how does fission actually work? The fuel source, rather than being isotopes of hydrogen, is uranium or thorium, which are two radioactive materials. Those work to produce a chain reaction, which is when extra neutrons get introduced to the uranium atoms, which get split into smaller atoms, and each time more neutrons are released to split even more atoms, and trillions of atoms undergo that process at one time, generating more and more heat. So taking a closer look at that, in the reactor, you produce heat. But why do you produce heat? Well, in the nuclear power plant, there's water. So that heat heats up the water, which turns to steam. That steam goes to a turbine, which is and it will spin the panels of the turbine, and that turbine is connected to a generator, which is at step 4. And then from the generator comes your electricity. The nice thing about fission is that the water actually gets recycled. So your hot water and leftover water will go through the cooling tower and then get reused back into the process. So, what are the similarities and differences, since I probably just spouted about a bunch of science at you? Technically, the similarities include that both fission and fusion work to produce heat through nuclear reactions, and both produce radioactive products. The difference is that fission has a chain reaction, and that chain reaction is what can cause so many accidents like explosions, and fusion doesn't have that. Fission also generates unstable nuclei that can be radioactive for millions of years. Briefly looking a little bit deeper at radioactive product, for fusion, during reactions, high-energy neutrons are produced, exposing the materials in the fusion structure to potentially become radioactive. Tritium itself is also a radioactive product, and having to deal with that all can be extremely expensive, which will add on to whatever the total cost looks like for fusion machines. But that's also one of the most relevant safety concerns, is how do you deal with the materials that have become radioactive? Economically, for fission, regulator fees are typically around $60 million per country per reactor, and that only makes up 5% of the total. The capital cost for fission can get up to $6 to $9 billion for 1,100 megawatts of power. And for fusion, while we don't actually have a built power plant yet, we can estimate that for a power plant with about 1,000 megawatts of capacity, it could range anywhere from $2.7 to $9.7 billion. And the reason this range is so large is because there are so many different steps in the process, whether that be regulation fees, licensing fees, or all of the fees it takes to actually get the materials that you need in order to build your plant. And then we have time considerations. For fission, the lifetime of a plant would be about 20 to 40 years. And from the idea of having, like, I want to start a power plant, to actually having it built, it takes about 10 years from start to finish. For fusion, as we don't have a plant, we don't have that data yet. So, therefore, what does the fission regulatory landscape actually look like? What is the current status for fission, since that's something that we've clearly determined? This is all listed under 10 CFR 52, which describes the licenses, certifications, and approvals for nuclear power plant. Specifically, in order to get a license for nuclear power plants, you have to have a description and safety assessment of the site. You have to talk about potential hazards. You have to describe what your proposed max power level is and how much electricity and energy your plant will actually be producing. And then you also have to talk about what the inventory of your contained radioactive materials will be. So that just means, what will your fuel sources be? How much of that will you have on hand? How much radioactive product will you be producing? Which are all very relevant in terms of safety concerns. So some of the biggest safety concerns when it comes to fission that has to be addressed under these regulations and licensing includes the first being nuclear proliferation, which is one of the key terms from earlier. Nuclear proliferation is taking fissile material, otherwise known as material that you use to build atomic weapons, is something that can happen for fission, as you have fuel sources like uranium and thorium, which are both radioactive materials that can be used to fuel atomic weaponry. So the goal is to try and prevent that. You also have to consider how to deal with radioactive waste, because so much of it gets produced in fission reactions. You also have to have an evacuation plan in case of an emergency, and you have to look at the security of the plant itself. So what does that mean for fusion? what does that currently look like? Because we don't necessarily have any finite things yet. However, the NRC, rather than wanting to regulate fusion like fission machines, they want to regulate it like a particle accelerator. What is a particle accelerator? Well, it means any machine capable of accelerating electrons, protons, and deuterons, or other charged particles in a vacuum, which is the exact definition of what a fusion machine is. However, this definition was by the NRC, so you have to take this with a grain of salt, as the NRC is really pushing for fusion machines to be regulated so that way they can be built, so there might be some pieces of information missing from this definition. So the particle accelerator licenses and regulations are all listed under 10 CFR 30. So why would you use this instead of using like a fission setup? The particle accelerator system addresses the radioactive product that will be produced in fusion systems. It will also ensure the safe decommissioning of particle accelerator buildings and facilities. Decommissioning means removing a facility or site safely from service, and that way they can remove all residual radioactivity. They will also have dose regulations, which means the maximum amount of radiation your plant can produce. That way you can protect the workers and the public by minimizing their radiation exposure. But what are the limitations of that system? One being nuclear. It doesn't encompass nuclear proliferation. Tritium, as I mentioned, is radioactive, and it can be an atomic weapon enhancer. While it's not a direct fuel source, it can still be an atomic weapon enhancer. However, it's not as big of a deal as nuclear proliferation would be for fission, as tritium has a much shorter half-life, and therefore the whole process would have to go a lot faster, so it's not as great of a concern. The other limitation is that using this system will bring about a longer period of regulatory uncertainty, as you're starting a whole set of regulations more from scratch than if you used a fission system and then made some edits to it. So, in conclusion, while fission and fusion are both nuclear forms of energy, they do have many differences, especially in relation to safety concerns. Fusion does not generate or use as much fissile material, and there are more minimal proliferation concerns for fusion than there are for fission. Fusion is also self-limiting, meaning if you can't control the reaction, the machine switches off by itself, which is an incredible feature. And then also fission conditions. So for fission, explosions can happen because of that chain reaction, but those conditions are impossible for fusion machines. Therefore, they cannot be regulated in the same ways. Regulations are all put in place for safety reasons, but if those are different for each system, they cannot and should not be regulated the same. So what does that entail? Nuclear fusion reactors will be regulated under 10 CFR 52, which is what it has been, while nuclear fusion reactors will likely and should likely follow 10 CFR 30, which is used for particle accelerators. But the one caveat with that is that there are some limitations to the particle accelerator system, as mentioned earlier, for example, nuclear proliferation, and therefore some elements of the fission regulations should be taken and added to the future set of fusion regulations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Great job. So I'd love to hear what drew you to this topic.
Yeah, so I'll be entirely honest, I didn't know where I wanted to go in terms of a project at first. I just knew that I wanted to do something and I wanted to get research experience. So I ended up joining the Launchpad program and just met with a bunch of various different mentors having experience in nuclear energy and law. And the mentor I had, her name is Soha, and she was an expert in nuclear energy. And my very first session with her, I was just so engrossed in what she was teaching me. And I just immediately knew I was like, I want to do something based on this. And I'm also really passionate about law. It's something that I try and incorporate in my school life and things like that. And so I was like, I would love to somehow combine my passion for law into a newfound interest of nuclear energy that you've shown me. And this is the project that came about from that.
That's really awesome. What are your next steps for pursuing this topic and field?
That is a really great question. Um, I think that I want to continue researching and just following along on what those regulations will end up looking like, and especially for fusion, like as of 2026, I believe the NRC will have they're planning, that's their goal, or sorry, 2027, that's their goal for having a full set of regulations. So just kind of like following up on that and following along with that, I think will be really great. And then also in the Q&A, when do you think is most likely to get approval first in the US, and how soon do you think that'll happen? As I mentioned, the NRC wants to try and get a set of regulations by 2027. That's their deadline. And likely it will probably happen around that time because so many people are working on it and they're really, really pushing for it. I know um, that it can be a super difficult process to try and create something entirely from scratch, but just the sheer amount of people and who are working on it and are putting the time into this, I think that that deadline will likely be followed.